At dawn on October 14, 2024, the military forces of the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command, including those of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force, began to deploy for battle from multiple directions on Taiwan Island. The joint military exercise codenamed the Joint Sword 2024B officially kicked off. During the exercise, the various services and arms of the People's Liberation Army jointly carried out multiple exercise items such as port blockade and control, regional seizure of power, sea assault, and land strike, fully verifying the troops' ability to conduct multi-domain cooperation, system confrontation, and precision strikes. In the evening of October 14th, after a day of exercises, the Eastern Theater Command of China announced that the Joint Sword 2024B military exercise had successfully completed all exercise items and thus ended regarding Joint Sword 2024B. Although it may not be extremely thrilling for everyone, it is a carnival for media personnel and also leaves many questions. First, why did the Chinese Coast Guard formation join the Joint Sword 2024B exercise on a large scale this time? Second, what exactly does port blockade and control, which is regarded as the top priority in this military exercise, mean? Third, why did such a large-scale Joint Sword 2024B end after just one day? Let's first address the second question. Why did we specifically conduct the exercise item of port blockade and control in this military exercise? In fact, this is directly related to the economic structure and geographical environment of Taiwan Island. Some time ago, the Center for Strategic and International Studies CSIS, headquartered in Washington, D.C., released a report titled How Will China Mainland Blockade Taiwan? The report analyzes the economic and social status quo of Taiwan Island very clearly. This report points out that as an island isolated overseas, Taiwan has very limited natural resources and is much more dependent on foreign trade than other large economies. Taking 2022 as an example, Taiwan's import and export industries accounted for 61% and 69% of its GDP respectively. It is an absolute export-oriented and foreign trade-dominated economy. Once blocked, it will suffer a catastrophic disaster. Not only will the blockade of Taiwan's ports lead to the collapse of Taiwan's economy under appropriate conditions, the economic blockade of Taiwan's ports will also lead to the collapse of Taiwan's social system. The CSIS report points out that Taiwan Island has only enough coal and natural gas reserves for 2 months of power generation, and its crude oil reserves and grain reserves are only enough for 6 months. In contrast, more than 97% of Taiwan Island's energy depends on imports, and 70% of its grain also depends on imports. If China cuts off Taiwan Island's energy and food supplies through port blockade, there is no doubt that Taiwan will gradually lose the necessary electricity and food. The lights on Taiwan Island will gradually go out, and the snacks at Shilin Night Market will gradually disappear. The entire Taiwan will fall into an extremely difficult situation of lacking food and electricity. If this situation persists, the inevitable result will be social disorder on Taiwan and the start of a national chicken-eating competition. In fact, I think the CSIS report has overlooked one point. That is, the geographical structure of Taiwan Island. Geographically, Taiwan Island has a dual structure, consisting of the main island and the outlying islands composed of Kinmen, Matsu, Dongyan, Penghu, and Dongsha. These outlying islands were used as outposts by the Taiwan military in the past. However, correspondingly, due to being isolated at sea, they are geographically quite vulnerable. For example, Kinmen now even needs fruits, vegetables, and even tap water provided by Xiamen in mainland China. Once blocked by the People's Liberation Army, let alone economic collapse and social disintegration, it is likely to surrender directly. Therefore, blockade itself can be used as a military means to solve the problem of the outlying islands. So, this is why in the Joint Sword 2020-4B military exercise, our military lists port blockade and control as an important exercise item. And the reports also focus on the main factors of port blockade and control. In fact, in my perception, the focus of China's exercise in this military exercise is this port blockade and control. All other actions are creating a situation for port blockade and control. For example, regional seizure of power, sea assault, and land strike are all in parallel for land strike. China will most likely use forces such as the conventional missile forces of the Rocket Army, assigned to the Theater Army, the long-range rocket artillery forces of the Army, and the cruise missiles of the Air Force and Navy. The preemptive strikes target important operational nodes, important command and communication hubs, and major combat assets of the Taiwan military, including everything from combat aircraft to ground-based missiles to long-distance warning radars. For sea assault, mainland China will most likely use bombers such as the H-6KJ with YJ-12 Theater anti-ship missiles. The J-16 fighter jets will carry YJ-83KKH tactical anti-ship missiles to target Taiwan's surface warships that have already left port or are urgently leaving port to evade, as well as various Coast Guard ships of Taiwan's Coast Guard administration, to minimize Taiwan's naval combat capabilities to the greatest extent for regional seizure of power. Mainland China will obviously use a combination of J-20 and J-16 fighter jets, carrying air-to-air missiles. They target the Taiwanese fighter jets that survived and took off urgently after the first round of conventional missile and long-range rocket firepower strikes. After clearing away Taiwan's only tactical air force, they establish air supremacy over Taiwan Island. According to the People's Liberation Army's planned battle deployment of all-out assault, after the first and second rounds of firepower strikes, the entire combat system of the Taiwan military can be completely broken. Then, it can enter the stage of port blockade and control of Taiwan. So, this is why in my perception, the focus of this joint military exercise against Taiwan is on practicing port blockade and control. So, why did mainland China not only use the military forces of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force in this exercise of port blockade and control, but also dispatch for Coast Guard formations of the Chinese Coast Guard to cruise around Taiwan Island? In fact, this point has also been mentioned in the CSIS report. The CSIS report points out that during the blockade of Taiwan, the Chinese side can dispatch some Coast Guard forces for coordinated law enforcement. These Coast Guard ships participate in law enforcement, citing the relevant provisions of China's domestic law, the Anti-Secession law. This limits the Taiwan issue within the country and restricts it to a domestic legal issue, thus thwarting the attempts of foreign forces to internationalize the Taiwan issue. The Coast Guard ships are responsible for intercepting and boarding and inspecting ships attempting to enter the restricted navigation area. Of course, they will also inspect ships on Taiwan Island attempting to escape unless these ships defect to the mainland, thus forming a binary pattern where the Navy and Coast Guard forces cooperate, with the Navy forces responsible for deterrence and the Coast Guard forces responsible for specific law enforcement. This is the fundamental reason why in this Joint Sword 2020-4B, mainland China not only dispatched the Navy, but also the Coast Guard forces to participate in the exercise and conduct cruises around Taiwan Island, why only lasted for 1 day. Having addressed the first and second questions, let's answer the third question. Why did the Joint Sword 2020-4B military exercise end after just 1 day? Well, in my opinion, since it is a military exercise, as long as the exercise purpose is achieved and the operational thinking and battle deployment are verified, then it's fine. As for how long it lasts, it doesn't seem to make much difference. What is the main exercise content of mainland China's Joint Sword 2020 for B this time? As we said before. First, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force jointly conduct joint sea and air fire preparations. Destroy all the major targets on Taiwan Island that should be destroyed. Finish off all the Taiwanese naval surface ships or aircraft that try to escape. Then, the Naval Frigate Detachment and the Coast Guard forces will be dispatched together to surround Taiwan Island and blockade the ports of Taiwan Island. The former is the foundation of the latter. Only by demilitarizing Taiwan Island as a whole can the subsequent blockade of the island be carried out smoothly. As for how the subsequent blockade will be carried out, in my opinion, mainland China actually doesn't need to conduct further drills. Let's not mention other things. At Shenbin Reef and Rena-I Reef in the South China Sea, how long has there been a standoff with the Philippine Coast Guard? The encirclement of that dilapidated Philippine ship has also lasted for a long time. Isn't this a ready-made blockade operation? And it's even the kind of training through actual combat. Therefore, in the Joint Sword 2020 for B exercise, after the People's Liberation Army completed the joint sea and air fire preparations and the Coast Guard ships and Navy surrounded Taiwan Island, the exercise purpose was actually achieved. In addition to achieving the exercise purpose, we also need to consider the impact of military exercises on the daily lives of residents and economic development. After all, it's not yet the time for earth-shaking changes. There are hundreds or even thousands of civil aviation flights passing over the Taiwan Strait every day. There are no fewer than 7,000 or 8,000 civilian ships and fishing boats sailing through the Taiwan Strait every day once China's joint sea and air operations start. These thousands of civil aviation flights and thousands of large and small ships passing through the Taiwan Strait will either take detours or suspend operations. One can imagine how much impact this will have on the punctuality rate of flights along the entire southeast coast and how much impact it will have on the economic development and people's production and life along the southeast coast. Of course, many people may say that for the ultimate goal of earth-shaking changes, everything must give way to this highest goal. But now it's not yet the time for earth-shaking changes, so trade-offs need to be made where necessary. The normal production and life of the people should still be considered. This requires that in exercises in the Taiwan Strait, the exercise time should be shortened as much as possible. If it can be completed in one day, it should not take 2 days. Lifting the navigation blockade as soon as possible and allowing civil aviation flights to take off, and fishing boats and merchant ships at sea to sail again are also factors to be considered. Therefore, it's not a big deal that China's Joint Sword 2020 for B military exercise lasts only 1 day. In general. In fact, judging from the situations of Joint Sword 2020 for A and Joint Sword 2020 for B this year, China is making preparations for the Taiwan issue. And there seems to be a trend of using different exercise occasions and forms to practice different combat methods targeting Taiwan Island.